All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon session of day 2. Welcome to the 5th annual Watershed Conference. As you probably experienced now, this is an experiment of hybrids, both in person and virtual. So please hang with us, and we will be definitely asking for feedback after the conference to see what worked and what didn't. I'd like to start this session with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that the land and water now under our care is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Lenape. We pay respect to the Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. We respect the knowledge, culture, and traditions which have contributed to the conservation of land and water. We also acknowledge that historic white supremacy and environmental racism practices have caused disproportionate environmental and climate impacts on people of color and overburdened communities. The Watershed Institute pledges to work for clean water and a healthy environment, including the communities that have been unjustly affected by systemic racism and environmental pollution. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Dodge Institute, who has funded our programs for a number of years, our conference sponsor, Princeton Hydro, Lake Hopatcong Foundation, and Musconetcong Watershed Association. And then I'm going to introduce our speakers in the right order. So Brianne Callahan is from New Jersey Future. She works to help New Jersey localities create stormwater utilities more affordably and effectively. Everyone's bio is in our packet, so I'm not going to go through everyone's, but Dan Bachalis serves as the chairperson of the Hammonton Environmental Commission since 2018, and he's serving as the chair of the town's Lake Water Quality Advisory Committee. And then we have Jim Purcell. He is the Princeton land use engineer. He gets to go to all the planning board meetings at night, and he has been instrumental in helping Princeton work through its stormwater management ordinances. And I've had the pleasure of working with him for the last couple of years now. So with that, I'm going to hand it over.
We just check in with our virtual audience and make sure we haven't heard anybody actually acknowledge.
All right. Could someone just give a thumbs up or put in the chat that you can hear us? Again, this is an experiment. We were doing things differently this afternoon than we did this morning and then what we did yesterday, trying to provide the best experience. All right, so now I will hand it back over to Bree. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. As Mike mentioned, my name is Brianne Callahan. I am the stormwater manager at New Jersey Future. At New Jersey Future, we envision healthy places where people can live, work, and play, and have safe streets and clean waterways from flooding and pollution. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based out of Trenton, and we work throughout the state on infrastructure and land use and environmental issues. And I'm here to talk to you today about stormwater utilities. Here we go. So today I'll talk a little bit about current stormwater funding practices. It's okay. Oops. I'm sorry, Zoom is not coming up. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, great. So I guess that's my hiccup after lunch. Please don't fall asleep on me now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about current stormwater funding practices. We'll talk a little bit about, just introduction to stormwater utilities in general. I'm going to go briefly over some stormwater utilities resources, and then we'll get a municipal perspective from Dan, from Jim, and answer some questions. So, all right, let's get started. So right now, the way things are, without a stormwater utility, the price of managing stormwater is included in all other government costs. Typically, these costs are included in sewer fees or property taxes. And this system, in many cases, can lead to underinvestment in managing stormwater and lending itself to a system of deferred maintenance. So unfortunately, this strategy results in residents bearing the brunt of flooding, traffic congestion, water pollution, and property damage. So what are your options? Well, you could do nothing, which in many cases, really isn't an option. People are struggling with flooding, water quality issues, like I mentioned a few seconds ago, public safety. So you can increase property taxes, you can increase sewer rates, or one of the tools that we have now in New Jersey is to create a stormwater utility. So what is a stormwater utility? A stormwater utility is a local assessment district, dedicates funding specifically and solely to stormwater management problems. And that's really important. The legislation that we have really provides that the funding will not go to anything other than stormwater management costs. So, and it's like any other utility, like your electric or your, water. So throughout the country, you wonder if, at this point, people are usually wondering, what does it mean? Is this a new concept? And it's not a new concept. New Jersey is the 41st state to enable stormwater utilities. There are over 2,000, well, close to 2,000 utilities throughout the country. And if you look at the maps up on the screen, you can see from 2009 to 2019, the real increase in the amount of stormwater utilities. As there's increases, you'll see it's darker in color. And if you look at the map, you can see that it's really a range of places where you'll find stormwater utilities. It's not in red states or blue states or southern states or rural, urban. And it's really across the board. In fact, in Florida, there's a stormwater utility in a municipality that has a population of 88 people, and it's very rural. But yet you'll find a stormwater utility also in Los Angeles, which has 3 million people. So really, there's a real wide range. So taking a step back, I'd like to briefly speak a little bit about the enabling legislation in New Jersey and the basic mechanics of stormwater utilities. The Clean Stormwater and Flood Reduction Act was signed into law by Governor Murphy in 2019. The law is permissive, which means that it allows but doesn't require local governments to establish stormwater utilities. Now, if established, these stormwater utilities must collect fees based on the amount of stormwater that a property generates. Typically, this is a function of how much hard, or you've probably heard the term impervious surfaces are on a property. In terms of establishment, utilities can be created by municipalities, counties, groups of municipalities, and sewerage and improvement authorities, and can be done regionally in nature. And as I mentioned earlier, and can't stress enough, the funds generated from the utility fees are dedicated solely to stormwater management and can't be used for other purpose. And this is in the legislation. Okay, so what's so great about this? Well, first, a stormwater utility is equitable. As we discussed earlier, a property is assessed a stormwater utility user fee based on the amount of impervious cover that it has. So this means the properties that generate stormwater pay for their contribution to the problem. When a stormwater costs are recovered through other funding mechanisms like taxes or sewer charges, tax-exempt properties or properties that don't have any water sewer services, think parking lots, wouldn't pay for their fair share of the cost of managing stormwater. This also includes, nonprofits, big schools, hospitals. All those folks are not paying their fair share of managing stormwater because they're not paying either property taxes or they don't have water sewer connections. So the next thing is that a stormwater utility is dedicated and stable. So the fee that I mentioned before, the fee revenue must be spent on stormwater needs and can't be shifted. The revenue is generated continually, providing a stable source, a stable continual stream of income, usually in monthly or quarterly billings, depending on how the municipality or whoever is setting it up would like to manage it. So this is really helpful to municipalities because it enables them to proactively plan and budget for projects, which avoids costly emergency repairs that normally occur when system maintenance is deferred. Also, and this is also very important, New Jersey has a statutory budget cap, which limits municipal increases to 2% per year for operational spending. With the stormwater utility, the operations and maintenance costs like street sweeping services and catch basin cleaning would no longer be included in the 2% cap. So you could actually take that money that you're spent on operations and maintenance and take it out of the budget, the property budget, or the tax budget, and put it into the stormwater utility. So this frees up monies and for other general fund needs like emergency services and education. So if a municipality is up against the cap, it gives them a little bit of room. Another thing I'd like to mention is that the sole exemption under New Jersey law is active agricultural and horticultural land. So this means that everyone has to pay the user fee. So this brings me to what a stormwater utility can pay for. So it can pay for the actual establishment of the stormwater utility itself. It can pay for capital expenditures like planning and design and engineering, construction, improvement of the stormwater management system. And this can include green infrastructure as well as your traditional gray infrastructure. It can pay for operations and maintenance, asset management, public outreach and education, any of the things that are required through MS4 permits, any of the things really, as the EPA guidance provides, it can really include any stormwater management expenses. So just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of what this might look like in terms of the costs, if we talk about tax or water sewer fee versus user fee funding, which is what a stormwater utility would be, if you take a look at this slide, you can see in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, there's the fee distribution between residential and non-residential based on wastewater flow, and then based on impervious area. And if you look at the numbers, you can see residential versus non-residential. With the stormwater, with the user fee, the residential customers pay 23% of the costs, which is down from 48% of the cost if it's based on property tax revenue. This is due to the fact that under a stormwater utility, the fee distribution is based on the impervious cover amount. Okay, so that brings us to credits. This is also really important. With credits, under New Jersey law, municipalities or whoever's setting up the utility must provide credits. So any user will be able to lower their costs if they actually manage the stormwater on their property. So they're allowed to, so each municipality has to come up with a credit system so that stormwater utilities can help folks lower costs by managing the stormwater on their property. Because really the main goal is to manage and lower the amount of stormwater that's created. It's not necessarily to, secure funding. And this is kind of exciting because it promotes green initiatives, sustainable development, and environmental stewardship. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about the process. So there are 8 basic steps to establish a stormwater utility. And a lot of folks can split this up, different ways too, but these are the main things. So you want to vet the concept with local officials. You want to establish a core team of internal experts, and you want to engage the mayor or county executive or utility director, whoever the folks are that are going to be making these decisions. The next step is to authorize a feasibility study to identify the options that best, meet the needs of your community. And the feasibility study is typically done by a consultant who would come, a financial and engineering consultant who would come in and take a look at all the different ways that you could set up a utility, really taking advantage of the infrastructure that you have in place, and trying to take advantage of cost savings wherever you can. Then you perform some ongoing stakeholder and outreach activities, making sure the community is involved, making sure the community understands what's going on. And also, it's really important to make sure that they're involved in how it's going to be set up. Then there's an implementation phase, and finally the launch. So in doing community research, there's important questions that a municipality or a community would want to answer in doing, in investigating whether a stormwater utility makes sense for them. So what are your problems? What are your community's goals for managing stormwater? Do you have a lot of capital, improvements that you need to make, or is it repair work? Do you need a different structure? Do you need more resources? And what is the current cost of inaction? These are all just some things that you might want to consider. And this is broken out just in a little bit different form. If you have any of these compelling stormwater management needs, do you need to enhance services? Do you need to solve particular problems in the community? Are you under a consent decree? Do you have, other water quality issues? Do you need to establish dedicated funding because you need to meet, you want to have bonding requirements? These are all the things that municipalities would want to consider in addressing whether a stormwater utility makes sense. So moving on to some resources, New Jersey Future has put together a Stormwater Utility Resource Center, which has detailed information about all of these particular areas. It talks about why stormwater matters, what a stormwater utility actually is, and goes through establishing a stormwater utility. And why this is useful is because we actually had an advisory panel of lawyers and engineers and municipal officials to help us, figure out the best way to convey the information. So if you're looking for information about stormwater utilities, this is a good place to start. And here is some of the information that it has: what the key benefits are, common myths, the particular New Jersey legislation. It's got technical New Jersey specific information and information about stormwater utilities around the United States. The other thing that it has that's really helpful is when we talked about public outreach, this is part of the resource center that goes directly to potential stakeholder committee meetings and topics. It goes from the committee members that you might want to include, and goes specifically through each particular meeting that would be useful to make sure that you really do public engagement well. And then there are a couple of resources that are available. New Jersey Futures put together a list of pro bono technical consultants who've agreed to meet with municipalities on a limited basis to chat about where they're headed, where they're starting from. We also have a peer learning exchange. So we would hook you up with municipalities who've actually put together stormwater utilities throughout the country, who've done a really good job. And then we're willing to chat with anybody on direct support, make presentations to environmental commissions. And actually, one of the commissions that we've spoken with is my friend Dan. So we can get started to the next section.
Informative. I thought it was very interesting. Bree had that slide with the stormwater utilities in 2009 and 2019. I think the first bill authorizing stormwater utilities was introduced in 2009. So I think it was like a 10-year endeavor to get stormwater utilities brought to New Jersey. So I like that. All right. So we're going to do this more of a question and answer and a discussion. So Hammonton, how far along is it in the process of sort of looking at stormwater utilities? Because so far, no one in New Jersey has done stormwater utilities.
Well, we started, I guess, I want to say 2019, but it might have been 2018. We had a couple of presentations by the League of Conservation Voters Conservation Fund to both the town council and to the environmental commission about the idea of stormwater utilities, stormwater management, and after discussing it internally and then with the mayor, after an unfortunate remark in the local newspaper, he gave the go-ahead to apply actually for a grant for a feasibility study And so we got that application in, I guess, August of 2020. One thing we found was while the pandemic kept us from gathering together and having meetings in face to face, it didn't slow down our ability to submit grants. So we submitted a lot of grants during 2020, and actually I guess we're at 7 for 7 at this point. So it's a pretty productive year despite the limitations imposed on us otherwise. So in fall of 2020, the grant was awarded, and we did select Princeton Hydro as our consultant to conduct the study. January 2021, after some preliminary discussions, the study commenced with an initial limited stakeholder Zoom meeting, and following that, getting some kind of broad brush feedback from key informants. Our consultant did some background research, collected a lot of data from our public works and our utilities departments, and had a broader stakeholder meeting, again via Zoom, at the end of May. They worked to consolidate some of the feedback from that, held some, I think, additional meetings with our town's Public Works and Transportation Committee, which is comprised of our mayor, a couple of council members who are responsible for utilities and public works, business manager, a public works manager, a few other folks. And that's kind of where we are. Right after that, it was end of May, got into the summer. Then we approached the silly season or election time. And one thing I should say, I should have said this initially, Hammonton's a really conservative town. You're nodding your head, you know Hammonton. Yeah, very conservative town, politically and socially and financially. There's a lot of do-it-yourself approaches to things, even if sometimes they're not legal. Are we recording this? We are recording.
Yes.
But by and large, it all works out, and it makes us really dependent on volunteer activities and people really pitching in the communities. It's relatively tight knit in that regard. We have a vibrant Main Street and Chamber of Commerce, so the business community is active in reviving what had earlier in the 80s and 90s been a really bad scene downtown and throughout the town. We've also had some demographic changes where we've got younger couples either moving in or moving back in, having been away from town for a long time, to find a revived scene. So there's more of an interest in moving innovations along in town rather than just sticking with the same way of doing things. That said, election times are basically times where people take cheap shots at each other, or at least one party takes a lot of cheap shots at other people. And it was felt that rather than finish the study up in a fashion and get it out there, would just create, frankly, more unnecessary targets for people who don't have the information that they need to make sensible statements. And I'm being a little harsh here, and there's a reason for that. It's because it's true. And I can give you lots of examples, but I'll do that off record. So we put a hold on the study because we wanted to make sure that it received the sensible attention that it really deserves, looking at the facts, looking at the benefits and the costs. So we don't have the study done at this point to give a long-winded answer to your question. We will have continuing discussions with the mayor and council members responsible for the utilities and that sort of thing, to make sure that they're prepped to give this the kind of objective consideration it really deserves. We're also doing some outreach. We've got a rain garden tour scheduled for November 13th. And we've invited the mayor and council members, some of whom have said they would be there to participate, business leaders in the town and other folks who basically general public or people who might actually be disposed to consider this in a favorable light. So we want to do that because we've been working on green infrastructure for several years. It's been a collaboration with a whole lot of partners locally and regionally, just a few of whom, if I may, include obviously Mayor and Council, Public Works and Utilities Departments, the Environmental Commission and the Lake Water Committee, because our stormwater directly affects our lake. Our Green Committee, a Parks and Recreation Commission, our Town Engineer, a Greater Hammonton Permaculture Club, and regionally and statewide with New Jersey Future, the League of Conservation Voters Environmental or Education Fund, Pinelands Preservation Alliance, Rutgers University Water Resources Program, Sustainable Jersey, Atlantic County Government, Atlantic County Utilities Authority, our two watershed ambassadors, since we stand in two different river watersheds, and Princeton Hydro. And I'm probably missing other partners that we've worked with over the years to bring us along to this point, getting people used to the idea of green infrastructure, the fact that Hammonton is going to need to revise its stormwater ordinance, which we have kind of in queue. We're going through a master plan revision of all sorts of things. So we've got that in queue for 2022. We're hoping to wrap up this particular feasibility report now that we've gotten the election behind us, hopefully wrapping it up by the end of the year or at least early January and getting that out to the public, to the mayor and council, January, February, maybe March of 2022. And then the fun will begin as we discuss what we need to do next. One thing I'd point out in terms of some lessons learned is that the studies are more expensive than we anticipated, and we're not actually going to get rates established or rates proposed as a part of this study. So we'll probably do a second study once we've discussed the pros and cons of the stormwater utility, which is a good thing because it kind of helps us, I hate to say kick the ball down or kick the can down the road or whatever the phrase is. It helps us defer an actual decision until we get more facts, which I think will give us time to do more public outreach, more discussion with our elected officials and the folks in our public works and utilities departments to make sure they understand and appreciate it. And frankly, I think our public works and utilities folks appreciate the idea of a stormwater utility. It gives what I would call utility equity, making sure that stormwater management becomes a focus in and of itself, because our stormwater systems, as in a lot of municipalities, are neglected. I did a review of one particular line that feeds directly into our lake, and I think out of about 40 or 50 inlets, 47 of them were completely silted up, so that the water comes in and goes straight out, carrying everything along with it. Otherwise, the pit is completely filled up. Some of them were filled up to the grate, and there was grass growing on top of them. So if we had a utility, we'd be able to pay attention to that. So hopefully early next year, we'll begin the next phase.
And it's really important to understand the unseen nature of some of this. But before I ask more questions, I had wished this panel was comprised more of disparate municipalities, because Princeton being a very, very conservative town. Jim.
I was going to start by saying, wow, what a difference there is between Princeton and Hammonton, because election season means nothing to us. We are, as you will probably all know, we're a one-party town. So We don't stop for any of the silly season. Everything
Got it.
continues to go along.
Maybe I need to move back.
Where we are with the feasibility study is not anywhere near where Hammonton is, because we just got an RFP put out on the street and we're waiting for responses. So once we get the responses, we'll start the process that you were already so deeply involved in. I do want to talk about where we are in terms of our stormwater management within Princeton as a prelude to getting a stormwater utility. First of all, probably like many municipalities, we don't have a really good handle on what our stormwater management system is composed of. It's been put together over a century, and what's connected to what and where it discharges to. We do know where all of our outfalls are, but we have no idea what's connected to those outfalls. So we do have an ongoing, we're kicking off a GIS study to identify every inlet, every pipe, and determine what systems, how they're interconnected and what is flowing to those systems. So, I mean, that's a really basic step that has to be done before we can actually determine any kind of mitigation or fees. As we're looking at a stormwater utility, we're looking at using funds that we could gather from it in order to do stormwater mitigation. We are, even though we are now one municipality, we are still two different towns. We are still the borough, we are still the township. There are two different physical infrastructures that we have to deal with. Two major watersheds that we deal with. The Stony Brook watershed is one type of a watershed that has a lot of residential open space components to it. The Harrisbrook watershed, which I've been told is the flashiest stream in the country, starts in downtown Princeton, underground in Spring Street, hence the name Spring Street. And every piece of impervious area in the central business district drains into that stream. We have a couple of major tributaries to it as well that are the focus of new development that's just been approved. We're building 700 to 800 new units of housing, and they're mostly in the Harrisbrook watershed. So our concern and what we want a stormwater utility for is to, again, equitably spread the costs to the business community, the nonprofits, the residential community, and use that to mitigate the flooding issues that we see in both watersheds. But Harrisbrook is one that's the most important to us because a lot of residents live right along the brook. Stony Brook is less of a concern because most of the residences that live along the Stony Brook are larger lots and the houses are much further away from the stream than the others. So what we've been doing in the couple of years that I've been there is modifying our ordinances. And I believe that we have the strictest stormwater management ordinances in the state at this point. Is that about true, Mike?
I think so.
With the stormwater management rules that NJDEP promulgated recently, they gave us the opportunity to actually go above and beyond. We have created we created two ordinances that went into effect in March. One was for major and minor developments that established the criteria at a higher threshold than NJDEP. So if you have 5,000 square feet of new impervious, for example, you have to meet the major development criteria. We also created an ordinance for single and two-family house developments. If a development comes in, say it's a patio, a pool, a deck, an addition that increases impervious area by more than 400 square feet, property owner is now required to manage the two-year storm on site with green infrastructure. They not only have to treat the two-year storm, and we make it easy on them. We tell them it's 2 gallons per square foot of new impervious area. So you have to treat that on site. You have to retain the water quality storm, which equates to 0.78 gallons per square foot. So we're pushing a lot of bioretention solutions. When I came to work for Princeton in June or July of 2020, the go-to solution was dry wells in the backyard. And the first dry well I encountered was a failure. And of course, every other dry well I've encountered since then has been a failure. So even before this ordinance was in effect, I was pushing the engineering community that were working for the developers that were doing single and two-family homes to abandon the idea of dry wells and start putting in above ground green infrastructure. So we do have a lot of rain gardens and getting a lot of pushback that rain gardens are going to fail as well. And the argument is always because the homeowner won't maintain it. So we do have regulations in there that they have to self-report to us that they have maintained it on an annual basis. We do have the ability to go and inspect and make sure that things are happening. At the same time, and I have to give credit, by the way, and you give a lot of credit. I'm not going to run through a whole big list, but we have a flood and stormwater commission. It's actually a commission that reports to council on policy issues about flooding and stormwater management. Our monthly meeting is actually tomorrow. Mike is on that. And they were instrumental in developing these ordinances. We've recently developed one that is an amendment to the development ordinance that, if we can get it off the dime, would require that not only if you add new impervious area, but if you disturb existing impervious area, you have to take that into consideration and consider that that area was never disturbed. We call it our stormwater redevelopment ordinance. Interestingly, the major developers in town are okay with it. We can handle that. That's not a problem. It's the infill developers in the central business district that are saying that it will stifle development because we currently have an existing lot that's 100% impervious. Now you're saying if I tear everything out, I have to treat it as if it was a wooded lot. We'd have to take the entire lot and turn it into a stormwater management system. And so we're struggling with getting it through. We have added in a clause that says to the greatest extent practicable. They don't like that language because it leaves it up to people like me to agree as to whether or not it was the greatest extent practicable. And I love it when we get into these arguments because they like to say, well, we trust you, but we don't know who's going to replace you when you leave. So we work very closely with property owners, with the engineers designing single and two-family homes and the larger developments. An example is one that was just approved, the 200-unit apartment complex at the Princeton Shopping Center, which is being built on existing parking lot. So they aren't increasing impervious area. They are decreasing the impervious area because they're going to put in some green space for their apartment complex. So they don't have to abide by our ordinances. They still have to abide by our SIS standards and NJDEP standards and show us that they've reduced the design storms to the peaks that they need to. But during the planning board hearing, we discussed things like, can you do something better? So they have agreed to go above and beyond, and they're going to remove some parking spaces that currently exist in the shopping center and put in bioretention swale and then a rain garden and some additional green space. So reducing the impervious area a little bit more. And that shopping center is one of my targets, unfortunately. I shouldn't call it targets. I think we can do a lot. It is the headwaters for one of the tributaries to Harry's Brook, and there is significant flooding on that tributary. So we're working every angle that we can, I think, Mike. And we have the support of the Environmental Commission, of course. We also discussed stormwater at our infrastructure and operations, and council's on board with everything we're doing. If we can just convince the developer community that this is the right thing to do, You know, and they have said that instead of a redevelopment ordinance or as part of a redevelopment ordinance, can we create a fund that we can pay into so we don't have to abide by it? So I think they would be supportive of a stormwater utility once we get going on it.
So there's a whole lot to unpack on that. You know, one of the things that occurs to me, you know, I when I started environmental lobbying, I started working on stormwater utilities. It was like a 10-year endeavor. And going through, you know, we passed the legislation in 2019. We still don't have any stormwater utilities in New Jersey, despite these things being a very old thing, and there's 2,000 models to look at. Part of it seems like, unlike most other things that government deals with, this is one of those things where you need a ton of education in order to wrap your head on why this is a good thing. You know, Dan, you mentioned you have, you know, stormwater pipes that are almost completely filled up, and it's, you know, it's underground, underground, out of sight. Thank you.
Out of mind.
Out of mind. You know, you have a network, you don't even know what is draining to that network. And people, while they understand they're being flooded out, I don't know that they always make that connection. So unlike, you know, passing a parking ordinance, and Princeton may not be a good example, because everything is a debate and a discussion, and you have a series of experts who live in your town that always are willing to provide their expertise, whether it's wanted or not. And I said that, not you. This is one of those things where I really think the education process, going slow and bringing everyone along, is very important. And one of the biggest things, and Bree, I'm gonna ask you this question, because, and this is the only time I'm ever gonna say this word. Why is it not a tax? Why is it not a rain tax? And why is it a fee? And why is that important? I can't believe I used that 3-letter word.
So the reason why it's not a tax and why it is a fee is because it's based on impervious cover. It's a user fee. You are using the stormwater management system. And that's why it's so important to take a look at this, because really it's a question of equity. It's not equitable the way the system is set up right now. So, you know, that is why it's so important to really take a look at, you know, what the system, what your system looks like, and really, you know, understand, you know, what you can, how you can make things better in your community. We talked about flooding, we talked about, you know, water quality issues. You know, these things are happening. We're getting more intense and, you know, more intense rainstorms, more frequent rainstorms, and it's not going away. So rather than having people, you know, get sucked away in rainstorms and all that sort of stuff, that's why you really want to have, you know, the user fee provide.
Wow. Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that one if I can. We are already taxing our residents for stormwater through property taxes. We are not taxing the municipality of Princeton and the school district or the churches or any of those others who contribute significant amounts of stormwater to our systems. I think of Trenton, where you don't even have a tax base because the state of New Jersey owns almost all the buildings. Well, this is a utility, just like any other utility. And they should pay for what they're contributing to the system that utility is. Nobody argues when they pay for their sanitary sewers. You know, and I'll get back to your question about out of sight, out of mind. Nobody thinks about whether or not when they flush the toilet where everything's going, but they expect that it'll go there. When what they do see is that we have inlets on the street, for example, and they expect that system's going to work, and it's not working anymore. But they also think that we can just drop an inlet in. Can you put another inlet in front of my house because this one's not working? Well, it's because the pipe doesn't work, and we've got to replace the pipe. It's under capacity. So the education piece is even more important than it would have been, say, when we decided that we had to have sanitary treatment, sewage treatment plants. We did have to go through this 50 years ago when we started with, when the EPA finally said we have to clean up our rivers. People had to understand, why can't I flush the toilet and have it go into the river anymore? There was an education process that was gone through. But this is a bigger education process because it's not coming out of their house. It's coming off their roofs, it's coming off their driveways, it's going into our street. Our systems don't have the capacity anymore. We have to replace them. If we don't replace them, then we have to provide mitigation somewhere down the line before homes are flooded out. And after Tropical Storm Ida, it's so much more important. I think people will understand it better, because people who got flooded during Tropical Storm Ida had never been flooded before. I'll give you another story. I had a property owner call me and say, the municipality is responsible for my flooding after this storm. You guys closed off the end of our street and put up a curb, and we've only been flooded twice since then. I said, what was the first time? I said, Hurricane Irene. I said to the mayor, I didn't say to the property owner, I said, they just showed us that our system in their area works. Because it's not designed to work for Ida. It's not designed for, it wasn't even designed for Henri, who was only a couple of weeks before Ida, but it still worked. So there's a lot of education that has to go on so the community understands why we need this. Our systems are adequate in most cases, but non-functional in a lot, and we have to fix that function.
I would agree. I think community education is the most important thing. I mean, with any of these storms, even, you know, less intense storms, I have a catch basin that's near my house that always overflows. And there are parents, it drives me crazy, that will let their kids go out and play in the flooding. And my kids are like, oh, mom, look, they have like all their tubes and stuff. And why can't I go out there? And I'm like, do you know what is in that water? And it drives my kids crazy, but I'm like,
Yeah.
I think the education, I mean, if people knew that there was, you know, antifreeze and all sorts of contaminants in that water that they were letting their kid splash around in during a storm, I think that there'd be a different story that we'd be hearing.
You know, one, just 3 quick points that you've touched on. One aspect of the finances that we're paying for our infrastructure through the property tax, operations and maintenance if it gets maintained. But municipalities also borrow to fix things, okay? Hammonton, 150, 200 years old. We've got pipes that are at least 100 years old, the old clay pipes, which is always lots of fun. We don't pay for that out of our municipal budget, by and large, except when we borrow money from either the state or other pots of money. And we have to pay that back with interest, and most of it's 0 or very low interest, but we're still paying something. People don't realize that we're getting hit twice for this. And if we had an ongoing source of revenue, could be relatively modest, we could eliminate that impact on the municipal budget. And make public education allows us to make that connection, to say, you know, if we had a utility, we'd be able to reduce the amount of borrowing that we do. And in Hammonton, that's a big issue. Our current administration has made a major point of saying, we're managing the borrowing so that in a couple of years, we're going to have major reductions in it. This just adds to that kind of progress in reducing the impact on the municipality. Likewise, our Lake Water Quality Committee was established specifically to look at the levels of E. coli bacteria in the lake, which we didn't have a handle on. We closed swimming down because we weren't able to meet the county standards frequently enough to justify the expense of having lifeguards and all that sort of thing. So through testing during the season, we find that it really happens 1 or 2 days after a major rain event. Well, so it's not the Canada geese who are living at the other end of the lake, because the beach area actually was relatively clean except after these rain events. we find out that the creek that flows into the lake, right next to the beach, is the one that I told you I did the review of the inlets,
47 inlets.
and it's all washing in from basically across town. So in a town of 5,000 households, we have about 4,000 dogs or more. And God knows how many cats. So our theory is, hypothesis is that that's washing into the lake, especially after a major storm. So we're working with Stockton University to get that, find some way to get DNA testing done, but that's another whole story.
Yeah.
So you got to make these local connections. Like we have a, like we can say to the folks in Hammonton, we have a lake committee to fix things up at the lake. One of the things we found is that we're getting things in the lake because of our inadequate stormwater management system. Stormwater utility would help us fix some of those issues by doing regular maintenance, that sort of thing. One issue that I raised actually a couple of days ago was one of the folks in town talking about this issue was, this is a shared responsibility, just as, for instance, I don't have any kids in our local school system, but I'm paying the school tax because everybody in a community has a responsibility to support education for the next generation. And they said, well, wait a minute, if you live in an area that doesn't have storm drains and you don't have any of that, why do you have to support the stormwater management system elsewhere in town? Because all of your water just goes into the ground. Maybe you have live on the outskirts and you've got a large lot, the water goes into your surface. I tried to make the pitch that this is a shared responsibility because you go downtown, you use the streets, et cetera, et cetera. That didn't quite wash yet, but
That's the tax
but-
argument.
yeah. And in terms of it being a tax, some people just aren't going to accept any additional fees, no matter what. I mean, when the answer is no, the facts really don't matter. That's just something we have to get over and again, make those positive connections, which will be able to crop up at the local level. And you could point out, we're doing this over here, why don't we do this? And we won't have to worry about this other issue that we've been focusing a lot of time on.
Well, a couple of things that I always like to say is everybody lives downstream.
Yes,
And so the shared
Yeah.
responsibility thing is you're impacting your neighbor whether or not you think you are. And the second thing is, and Bree touched on this, it's very important that we repeat that if you are doing something on your property, like we're requiring people in Princeton to do, you get a credit for that in the stormwater utility.
Right.
There's a reduction in your fee, maybe an elimination in your fee,
very important.
if you've met all the requirements and you're taking care of your own stormwater runoff on site. So I think that's important to make sure that people understand, oh, I can spend this much money now and put a rain garden in and not have to pay into this stormwater utility. That's a wonderful thing. Well, we don't charge people for sanitary sewage if they have their on-site septic system, right? So it's sort of the same model that we're looking at.
I know there was a question in the back. You had your hand up. Nope. So, yeah. So just speak, identify yourself and speak loudly.
Doug Michael, and I might be missing something, but when I looked at the original, you were showing me the legislation, and I know you're from Hammonton too. Right.
Yeah.
They said the sole exception was ag and horticulture. We went to some green infrastructure things the other day, and they say a lot of stormwater comes from sheet flow off of ag lands, and I've seen horticulture operations with lots of impervious surface. How do you balance that with equity if you have like these large facilities?
Oh, let me,
I
I will jump in quickly on that one. So yeah, if you are farmland assessed, you are exempt. And like I said, I was advocating for this thing for 10 years, and I strongly urge the legislature not to do that because of exactly that problem. If you take a look at the Raritan TMDL, a huge chunk in parts of our state, in the Raritan Basin, the problem is farmland.
Agricultural.
So if you exempt them from paying the fee, you've taken a huge chunk of the solution away as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else wanted to add, but.
I was
that's
just gonna
really
say, that's a
needed.
question for the legislature. That's not a
Yeah.
question for us. We
I was
didn't-
just wondering, if
Yes.
does that make it difficult for you, like, in Princeton, maybe not so much, Florence, Trenton, not so much, but someplace like
Hammonton's
Hammonton,
not
is
bad.
somebody gonna
It-
say, hey, there's these big producers, right, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
now, so in Hammonton, we're in the Pine Barrens, of course, so we've got, we're not only dealing with DEP regulations of a whole lot of variety, and Department of Ag regulations, but we also have the Pinelands Commission. And Hammonton Creek has been for years one of the most polluted, took the words right out of my mouth.
Sorry.
No, it's true. One of the most polluted streams in the Mullica River watershed. So we paid a lot of attention to it. Hammonton also treats its own wastewater as opposed to the rest of the county, which feeds into ACUA. It used to be that we were regularly dumping water into the creek because our settling ponds wouldn't handle it, that sort of thing. We've gone through a system of beneficial reuse where we're irrigating ball fields and other areas with our treated wastewater, which has pretty much eliminated our need to do that. So we hope to see some benefits in our relationship with the Pinelands Commission and DEP in that regard. The agricultural piece, I tend to think, and I think it's something that ought to be a loophole that ought to be fixed. But I'm hopeful that DEP and DOA are paying attention on other fronts to help reduce that, because they have I believe they have the wherewithal to do things if there's a big issue.
Yeah.
But it could certainly be tightened up, especially in this particular area.
But I understand part of your question is, how do you convince the rest of the community when so much of your community is actually exempt from this?
That
That's
was my
the
question.
public
Yeah.
relations
Yeah.
side of things.
I like that, for someplace like Princeton, you have Princeton U.
Yeah.
Lots of impervious surface there. Now they're gonna have to pay in. That seems a little fair.
Yeah,
And,
not a
you
lot of
know,
agricultural,
Well,
assessed as farmland.
Yeah.
Well, just speaking from Hammonton, since so much of the local economy is tied in, I mean, we've got a really good downtown thing going on, but so much of the local economy depends on, blueberries and sweet
Yeah.
potatoes and other crops.
Right.
People are sensitive to and supportive of agriculturally related issues.
Right.
So if they're getting an exemption from this particular legislation, most people in Hammonton, I haven't polled them, but I would expect wouldn't have a problem with that because they support the farmers.
Okay.
And in a small town, probably half the town is related to those farmers anyway. So they're not gonna get in trouble with their cousins or what have you.
Okay, and no, we just.
Yeah,
wanted that
no,
policy
it's a good question.
Really good
It's a good-
question.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
important.
Issue.
Yeah.
All right, I have, I guess, another question sort of. So we know the problems. We know that we are paying for it one way or the other. But it seems to me that we're not really paying for it because we're not really doing what's necessary. And some of those costs are indirect and some of those costs are hidden. For example, when the police have to close a road because you can't pass through it, there's a cost to that. Old Mill Road here, and I take it every day to come to work. 2 years ago, there was a big storm and I forget which it was. And there was like a 3-foot tall trunk, and it was huge, just sitting in the middle of the road. And it didn't get there on its own. The Stony Brook brought it, and someone had to move that. So there's a cost to that. So how does a municipality sort of wrap its head around the cost, both what they're actually paying and what they really need to be paying in order to address this problem?
Wow.
Well, it's just an easy question. I'm just gonna lob a softball.
Hey,
over there.
I'll give you an idea. If we had a utility in place and those kinds of things happened, and DPW had to go out and move that log, or the police had to go out and set up barricades and stop people, I'd charge back to the utility. I'd say that amount of money right there that you spent, that was overtime for the police department, back charge the utility. Because you're responsible as a utility to manage the stormwater within your town. And you know, just like FEMA's coming in now and saying you can charge, we'll reimburse you for all the costs that associated with Ida. Maybe the utility should reimburse the costs associated with failure to maintain the stormwater system.
Well, that's one of the first
Yeah.
questions, right? Is when you're figuring out how to set up a utility is how much am I actually spending?
Right,
Where are
yeah.
all these costs? Is it in DPW? Is it in the general budget?
It's
Is it,
everywhere.
it's everywhere. So pulling all those costs is really one of the bigger things to find out. So you can actually figure out like what, you know, what you're trying to get out of it, and what the cost, what the, you know, fees are gonna be.
I spend probably 10 hours a week dealing with stormwater issues for residents in Princeton.
Wow.
Regardless of the time. you just say.
Regardless of the time of the year.
Yeah.
Sophie just sent another person to me to discuss their stormwater problems, and I've got to, I got to respond to them.
Well, you send people our way, we send them your way.
Yeah,
and we're all worked
we
out.
share. I will give kudos to the watershed. They have been such a great partner with us. And they have, they've assisted our residents a lot when there are things that we can't do as a municipality, say a property owner is having a flooding issue, that's due specifically to either their, you know, property owner to property owner, or just flooding in their backyard. The education that the Watershed Institute will provide for them to do something on their own. We get a lot of phone calls from people say, what can I do? I know it's not the municipality's problem. We also get those phone calls that says the municipality has to fix this. And I have to say, no, this is not because of anything we did. But the Watershed Institute steps in and helps them design rain gardens or figure out some other system that can help them to mitigate on-site flooding. So,
Well,
like I
thank you for
said,
that.
we spent a lot of time together.
And Friday at 8:30 again.
That's tomorrow morning.
So, I mean, we talked about we're all paying for it, you know, through property taxes or through emergency services. We talk about, you know, the education component. Assuming a municipality in New Jersey joins the 40 other states and the 2,000 other stormwater utilities, is there a sense of what this would cost an average homeowner? Because I think that's also sort of one of those questions out there. Great, another something else I got to pay, and do we have a sense of what that is?
Sure, you can actually take a look at it through the Western Kentucky University does a national listing of all the stormwater utilities in the country, and they have the specific fees, but it's typically around the country, the average is about $5 a month
For an average.
for an
Home.
average home. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, for an average residence.
Yeah.
But you can take a look at the Western Kentucky. It's actually really interesting to see around the country what it looks like.
Yeah, that I haven't looked at this year's study, but yeah, they release that every year.
Yeah, great.
Black and Veatch also does a study, which is one of the consultants that helps municipalities. So we have a couple minutes, we have a few more minutes. Do people have questions both virtually and online? It's been relatively quiet.
I don't see any hands raised.
Darn, we put people to
Yeah.
sleep. I told you after.
No, you answered all their
I think we
questions
answered all
with
their
your
questions.
presentation.
So you know what? A couple more questions since I can talk forever. You know, at two very different stages of the game, and I don't know, Bree, is anyone further along on this process?
Yes.
Who would
Yes.
that be?
Well, I'm not supposed to say,
Okay,
but
I think I know.
there are multiple municipalities who are, you know, ahead of the game. Some who have finished their feasibility studies and are just trying to figure out details, specifics.
Mhm.
But yeah,
I have a question. Because we talk about how it could be done regionally. Has there been any discussions, for example, in Mercer County, that Mercer County Improvement Authority might take this on for the entire county?
I would fully support a county or regional approach.
But you haven't heard anything, because I haven't heard anything, and that's why I was just
Regional
thinking.
Stormwater management planning hasn't gone so well in New Jersey. in the
Yeah.
past.
Yeah, so that was actually gonna be one of my last questions. The stormwater rules allow for regional stormwater management at least since 2004. I don't know if it predated that.
That's when it came
Okay.
up and it tanked, absolutely tanked. I don't know that any of the attempts at regional stormwater management plans actually made it anywhere.
Not even up in North Jersey? No?
Yeah,
There's some watershed management plans that have worked to a certain extent on a regional basis.
Yeah.
That's worked much better, but the
Sure.
stormwater management plans that DEP for a while that was gonna be the savior.
Well, I will announce now then that, and it hasn't come to fruition yet, but we are going to be asking the Watershed Institute to help us to have a summit between Hopewell, Lawrence, and Princeton to discuss the Stony Brook watershed that impacts all three of our towns, but also as part of that summit, it's also to talk about mostly Province Line Road, because we really don't know who's responsible for what side of the road. But we
I should
wanna
almost
bring in
end on
those-
that, the epitome of the need for education. I don't even know what I own.
Yeah.
I will say, I have been, here through the Watershed Institute, talking, we have 30, depending on how you count the Stony Brook Millstone watershed, 30 towns. We have been talking about stormwater utilities since before the passage and have heavily urged the towns not to do their own, but to group together. Because Princeton can do everything right, and if those evil people in Hopewell don't, it's gonna happen. Princeton can do, everything right, and if West Windsor doesn't join, Princeton's still gonna get flooded. And Manville gets everything, so.
On the other side of that coin, I really don't want to take away one of my excuses. Sorry, I can't do anything about Stony Brook. It's all Hopewell's fault.
Yeah, yeah, I mean,
Anyway, no, we really should be looking more at a regional system like that. Harrisbrook is our problem because it is completely within. It's encompassed right in Princeton. Nobody contributes to it except us.
and you built on it and you covered it over and you named Spring Street.
Enclosed it back in the, what? 50s.
That's what you did back then.
We built houses over it. One of the biggest complainers is a guy who says the Harrisbrook keeps washing away my embankment. It's taking away my land. And pretty soon it's gonna undermine my house. Yeah, because the culvert goes underneath your house.
Yeah, and Vince Mazza yesterday in the NJ PAC rule said, until we start chipping away at everything we did before we had rules, we're never gonna solve it.
Yeah.
And stormwater utilities is, one of those mechanisms to help fund and institute programs to actually undo 100 years of development or 200 years of development where there were no rules. Princeton Shopping Center, as you said, was built in
1954.
There were no rules,
Nope.
no stormwater rules. And so, until you have a mechanism in place to help do it, or you're gonna tax everyone to build those things, it's never gonna happen. Any final thoughts from the panelists on stormwater utilities and how to get not 500 of them, but maybe a dozen or two regional?
For Hammonton, just stay tuned and we'll give a report next year. Hopefully sooner than that. Hopefully it goes well.
And we're gonna go it alone if we have to, but we're gonna try to engage our neighbors. We contribute also to Somerset County and Montgomery. What's that town north of us? So there may be some discussions on that side. Beedensbrook and Van Horn both flow into their watersheds. I think my final thought is just to recap the the importance of educating the community, and not just on what a stormwater utility will mean for them, but educating them on what stormwater is and how it is treated and conveyed, and what everyone can do to help alleviate the situation. And remind people that if they do it themselves, that their own cost burden, once a utility is established, is reduced. That's important to me, because people are like, as you said, not another bill I have to pay. Well, if you've got, and that's another thing that we're doing, is actually documenting what has been happening this year on individual properties, so that when we do institute a utility, we can turn to them and say, you're exempt, or you're reduced because you've already taken care of stormwater on your property.
And if anybody out there is thinking about it or wants more information or just wants to ask a bunch of questions, please contact me. This is what I do all the time, so I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. Great. So I want to thank everyone. This has been recorded, the presentation, and this recording is going to be made available to everyone. As Bree said, New Jersey Future has a ton of resources on their website. The Watershed Institute ran 2 or 3 conferences solely dedicated to stormwater utilities. This was pre-COVID, so we didn't record it, but the PowerPoints and the presentations and the material on site. If any of us can help with the conversation, we will be more than glad to do it, in New Jersey Future as well. And with that, unless there's any last minute question, thank you. We will see everyone tomorrow at 11 o'clock, where we have sessions including what happened on Tuesday and what that means. So thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks to our panelists. Great. I greatly appreciate your time and your knowledge. It was great.
Oh, okay.